Good morning. This is The Great Gatsby, Chapter 4. I'm doing a reading of this for you, my students, just in case you might have missed something. I'm going to try and do it all in one sitting. Hopefully the cat won't mess it all up, okay? Don't forget, for Chapter 4, you should be looking for any truth, lies, and rumors about Gatsby. And you should also make sure you're taking note of motifs in this. And there's a whole lot about illusion versus reality. So you should note those themes. And anytime you think you see anything having to do with the theme of the corruption of the American dream, which would be anything having to do with crime, illegal things, people making their money without actually working hard. Okay? So on page 61 of my book is where it starts. It says, one Sunday morning while church bells rang in the villages along shore, the world and its mistress returned to Gatsby's house and twinkled hilariously on his lawn. And we spoke in class that the word twinkled could happen to be a leitmotif. He's a bootlegger, said the young ladies, moving somewhere between his cocktails and his flowers. One time he killed a man who found out that he was nephew to von Hindenburg and second cousin to the devil. Reach me a rose, honey, and pour me a last drop into that there crystal glass. Now once I wrote down in the empty spaces of a timetable the names of those who came to Gatsby's house that summer. It is an old timetable now, disintegrating at its folds, and headed this schedule in effect July 5th, 1922. But I can still read the gray names, and they will give you a better impression than my generalities of those who accepted Gatsby's hospitality and paid him the subtle tribute of knowing nothing about him at all. A note in the next paragraph and following, we will look at some names, okay? And it's important that you might want to look these names up if you decide to write about the name motif. From East Egg, or Old Money, then, came the Chester Beckers and the Leaches, and a man named Bunsen, whom I knew at Yale, and Dr. Webster Civet, which is a cat, who was drowned last summer up in Maine, and the Hornbeams, a plant, and the Willie Voltaires, and a whole clan named Blackbuck, who always gathered in a corner and flipped up their noses like goats at whosoever came near, and the Ismays and the Christies, or rather Hubert Auerbach and Mr. Christie's wife, and Edgar Beaver, whose hair, they say, turned cotton white one winter afternoon for no good reason at all. Clarence Endive is also a vegetable, was from East Egg, as I remember. He came only once in white knickerbockers and had a fight with a bum named Etty in the garden. From farther out on the island came the Cheadles and the O.R.P. Schraders and the Stonewall Jackson Abrams of Georgia and the Fish Guards and the Ripley Snells. Snell was there 3 days before he went up to the penitentiary, or the prison, so drunk out on the gravel drive that Mrs. Ulysses Sweat's automobile ran over his right hand. The Danceys came too, and the S.B. Whitebait, who was well over 60, and Maurice A. Flink, and the Hammerheads, and Beluga, the tobacco importer, and Beluga's girls. Lots of animals there. From West Egg, or New Money, came the Poles, and the Mulreadys, and Cecil Roebuck, and Cecil Schoen, and Gulick, the state senator, and Newton Orkin, who controlled films par excellence, and Eckhost, and Clyde Cohen, and Don S. Schwartz, the son, and Arthur McCarty, all connected with the movies in one way or the other, and the Catlips, and the Bembergs, and G. Earl Muldoon, brother to that Muldoon who afterwards strangled his wife. Defanato, the promoter, came there, and Ed Legros, and James B. Rotgut Ferret, and the Dijongs, and Ernest Lilly. They came to gamble, and when Ferret wandered into the garden, it meant he was cleaned out and Associated Traction would have to fluctuate profitably next day. All in that paragraph, you should note the last names. They're all very ethnic. For example, Poles could refer to Polish. Mulready's, McCarthy, that's Irish. Cecil Roebuck and Cecil Schoen, that's all maybe German, but Jewish. Schwartz, German. And then you've got a phrase that's kind of important here. It says, all connected with the movies are one way or the other. And I would note to you that, remember, movies create illusion or fantasy, okay? We also have ferret. Ferret's an animal related to the weasel family, which is known for being sneaky. And they said rot gut. So what does that imply? And again, all of the, we got lily, orchid, both very elegant, fragile flowers. Just something to think about if you're looking at name motifs. Last sentence on page 62 says, a man named Klipspringer, which is a deer, a small African deer if you look it up, it bounces around a lot. A man named Klipspringer was there so often and so long, top of 63, that he became known as the boarder. I doubt if he had any other way home. So a boarder is somebody who stays at someone's house. Klipspringer goes to Gatsby's parties so frequently and gets drunk so often, he basically never goes home. And Gatsby has such a big house, he's like, meh, doesn't even care. Of the theatrical people, there was Gus Ways and Horace O'Donovan and Lester Meyer and George Duckweed and Francis Bull. That's another name, an animal motif. Also from New York were the Cromes and the Backhysons and the Denekers and Russell Betty and the Corrigans and the Kelleher's and the Dewars and the Scullys and the S.W. Belcher and the Smirks. That's an interesting word. And the Young Quinns, divorced now. And Henry L. Palmetto, another plant, who killed himself by jumping in front of a subway train in Times Square. Benny McClenahan arrived always with 4 girls. Again, not normal relationships here. They were never quite the same ones in physical person, but they were so identical with one another that it inevitably seemed they had been there before. I have forgotten their names, Jacqueline, I think, or else Consuela, or Gloria, or Judy, or June, and their last names were either the melodious names of flowers and months, or the sterner ones of the greater American capitalists, whose cousins, if pressed, they would confess themselves to be. In addition to all of these, I can remember that Faustina O'Brien came there at least once, and the Bedecker girls, and young Brewer, who had his nose shot off in the war, and Mr. Albruxberger, and Miss Hagg, his fiancée, and Ardita Fitzpeters, and Mr. P. Jewett, once head of the American Legion, and Miss Claudia Hip, with a man reputed to be her chauffeur, and a prince of something whom we called Duke, and whose name, if I ever knew it, I have forgotten. All of these people came to Gatsby's house in the summer. So now we have a space, which is a stylistic device that Fitzgerald is using, okay? There's a space, and when there's a big space in the paragraphs right here, it's indicating there's a different time and a different scene. So at 9 o'clock one morning, late in July, Gatsby's gorgeous car lurched up the rocky drive to my door and gave out a burst of melody from its 3-noted horn. It was the first time he had called on me, though I had gone to 2 of his parties, mounted in his hydroplane, and at his urgent invitation, made frequent use of his speech. "Good morning, old sport. You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together." He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that was so peculiarly American, that comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work or rigid sitting in youth, and even more, with the formless grace of our nervous, sporadic games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious, that's one of your vocab words, or careful or proper manner, in the shape of restlessness. Remember, restlessness is you can't sit still. He was never quite still. There was always a tapping of a foot somewhere, or the impatient opening and closing of a hand. All characterization in that paragraph of Gatsby, right? Those are mannerisms. He saw me looking with admiration at his car. "It's pretty, isn't it, old sport?" He jumped off to give me a better view. "Haven't you ever seen it before?" I'd seen it. Everybody had seen it. It was a rich cream color, bright with nickel, swollen here and there in its monstrous length, with triumphant hat boxes and supper boxes and tool boxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns. Sitting down behind the many layers of glass in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town. If it was me, I would note in that paragraph that Fitzgerald is using a lot of diction with the words monstrous and swollen and triumphant and terraced and labyrinth. And all of that is a metaphor to explain or show how big and shiny Gatsby's car is. Also, Fitzgerald is using a lot of ands to create this long list to show again how big and luxurious his car is. Okay, paragraph that starts on 64 with I had talked with him. I had talked with him perhaps 6 times in the past month and found to my disappointment that he had little to say. So my first impression, that he was a person of some undefined consequence, had gradually faded and had become simply the proprietor, which is owner, of an elaborate roadhouse next door. And then came that disconcerting ride. We hadn't reached West Egg Village before Gatsby began leaving his elegant sentences unfinished and slapping himself indecisively on the knee of his caramel-colored suit. So he's doing some things that make him seem very unsophisticated, not someone who's born rich. Look here, old sport, top of 65, he broke out surprisingly. What's your opinion of me, anyhow? A little overwhelmed, I began the generalized evasions which that question deserves. Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life, he interrupted. I don't want you to get a wrong idea of me from all these stories you hear. Ah, so he was aware of the bizarre accusations that flavored conversation in his halls. I'll tell you God's honest truth. His right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand by. I am the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West, right? The Midwest, all dead now. I was brought up in America, but educated at Oxford, because all my ancestors have been educated there for many years. It's a family tradition. He looked at me sideways, and I knew why Jordan Baker had believed he was lying. He heard the phrase, educated at Oxford, or swallowed it, or choked on it as though it had bothered him before, and with this doubt, his whole statement fell to pieces, and I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister or evil about him after all. What part of the Middle West? I inquired casually. San Francisco. I see. My family all died, and I came into a good deal of money. Again, we said that unless Gatsby's not very smart and doesn't know much about geography, he has to be lying, because San Francisco is on the West Coast, not part of the Midwest. His voice was solemn or serious, as if the memory of that sudden extinction of a clan still haunted him. For a moment I suspected he was pulling my leg or kidding me, but a glance at him convinced me otherwise. After that I lived like a young Rajah or prince in all the capitals of Europe, Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little, things for myself, top of 66 only, and trying to forget something very sad that happened to me long ago. With an effort, I managed to restrain my incredulous laughter. The very phrases were worn so threadbare that they evoked no image except that of a turbaned character, leaking sawdust at every pore as he pursued a tiger through the Bois de Boulogne. Okay, so Nick thinks he got this story from a character out of a book. So he doesn't believe him at all. Then came the war, old sport. It was a great relief, and I tried very hard to die, but I seemed to bear an enchanted life. I accepted a commission as first lieutenant when it began. In the Argonne Forest, I took 2 machine-gun detachments so far forward that there was a half-mile gap on either side of us where the infantry couldn't advance. We stayed there 2 days and 2 nights, 130 men with 16 Lewis guns. And when the infantry came up at last, they found the insignia or the signs of 3 German divisions among the piles of dead. I was promoted to be a major, and every Allied government gave me a decoration. Even Montenegro, little Montenegro down on the Adriatic Sea. Little Montenegro. He lifted up the words and nodded at them with his smile. The smile comprehended Montenegro's troubled history and sympathized with the brave struggles of the Montenegrin people. It appreciated fully the chain of national circumstances which had elicited this tribute from Montenegro's warm little heart. My incredulity or my disbelief was submerged in fascination now. It was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines. He reached into his pocket, and a piece of metal slung on a ribbon fell into my palm. So this is a metal, think like a metal that you would see someone in the military that would have pinned on their uniform. So he drops it in Nick's hand. That's the one from Montenegro. To my astonishment, the thing had an authentic look. So Nick reads it on the top of 67. Ordere de Danilo, ran the circular legend. Montenegro, Nicholas Rex. Turn it. So he flips it over. Major J. Gatsby, I read, for valor extraordinary. Here's another thing I always carry, a souvenir of Oxford days. It was taken in Trinity Quad. The man on my left is now the Earl of Doncaster. It was a photograph of half a dozen young men in blazers, loafing in an archway through which were visible a host of spires, which is just a whole bunch of old buildings, right? There was Gatsby, looking a little, not much younger, with a cricket bat in his hand. And cricket's a game they play in England. Then it was all true. I saw the skins of tigers flaming in his palace on the Grand Canal. I saw him opening a chest of rubies to ease with their crimson lighted depths the gnawings of his broken heart. I'm going to make a big request of you today, he said, pocketing his souvenirs with satisfaction. So I thought you ought to know something about me. I didn't want you to think I was just some nobody. You see, I usually find myself among strangers because I drift here and there, trying to forget the sad thing that happened to me. He hesitated. You'll hear about it this afternoon. At lunch? No, this afternoon. I happened to find out that you're taking Miss Baker to tea. Do you mean you're in love with Miss Baker? No, old sport, I'm not. But Miss Baker has kindly consented to speak to you about this matter. I hadn't the faintest idea what this matter was, but I was more annoyed than interested. I hadn't asked Jordan to tea in order to discuss Mr. J. Gatsby. I was sure the request would be something utterly fantastic, and for a moment I was sorry I'd ever set foot upon his overpopulated lawn, top of 68. He wouldn't say another word. His correctness grew on him as we neared the city. We passed Port Roosevelt, where there was a glimpse of red-belted ocean-going ships, and sped along a cobbled slum lined with the dark, undeserted saloons of the faded gilt 1900s. Remember, they're driving through New York. So Nick's talking about the different neighborhoods they're seeing. Then the Valley of Ashes opened up on both sides of us, and I had a glimpse of Mrs. Wilson straining at the garage pump with that panting vitality as we went by. With fenders spread like wings, we scattered light through half Astoria, only half, for as we twisted among the pillars of the elevated train, the L, I heard the familiar jug-jug spat of a motorcycle, and a frantic policeman rode alongside, so they're getting pulled over. All right, old sport, called Gatsby. We slowed down. Taking a white card from his wallet, he waved it before the man's eyes. Right you are, agreed the policeman, tipping his cap. Know you next time, Mr. Gatsby. Excuse me. What was that? I inquired. The picture of Oxford? I was able to do the commissioner a favor once, and he sends me a Christmas card every year. So basically, Gatsby gets pulled over and gets let go without getting a ticket by waving this card. And he says he's able to do the commissioner a favor every year. So he sends him a Christmas card. So basically, he has this, get out of jail for free card, okay? We're going to skip the next couple of paragraphs and jump over to 69 after the space where it says roaring noon. So we're at a different time now, a different scene. So it's roaring noon. In a well-fanned 42nd Street cellar, I met Gatsby for lunch. It's a different day now. Blinking away the brightness of the street outside, my eyes picked him out obscurely in the anteroom, talking to another man. Mr. Carraway, this is my friend, Mr. Wolfsheim. A small, flat-nosed Jew raised his large head, and regarded me with two fine growths of hair which luxuriated in either nostril. So he's got big hairs that stick out of his nose a little bit. After a moment, I discovered his tiny eyes in the half-darkness. So I took one look at him, said Mr. Wolfsheim, shaking my hand earnestly. And what do you think I did? What? I inquired politely, but evidently he was not addressing me, for he dropped my hand and covered Gatsby with his expressive nose. I handed the money to Gatsby, and I said, all right, Gatsby, don't pay him a penny till he shuts his mouth. He shut it then and there. Gatsby took an arm of each of us and moved forward into the restaurant, whereupon Mr. Wolfsheim swallowed a new sentence he was starting and lapsed into a somnolatory abstraction. Psalm, sleep, amble, walk. Something boring. Okay? If you're sleepwalking, you're probably bored. Top of 70. Highballs, asked the head waiter. This is a nice restaurant here, said Mr. Wolfsheim, looking at the Presbyterian nymphs on the ceiling, which is a painting. But I like across the street better. Yes, highballs, agreed Gatsby. And then to Mr. Wolfsheim, it's too hot over there. Hot and small, yes, said Mr. Wolfsheim, but full of memories. What place is that? I asked. The old metropole. The old metropole, brooded Mr. Wolfsheim gloomily, filled with faces dead and gone, filled with friends gone now forever. I can't forget so long as I live the night they shot Rosie Rosenthal there. It was 6 of us at the table, and Rosie had eaten drunk a lot all evening. When it was almost morning, the waiter came up to him with a funny look and says somebody wants to speak to him outside. All right, says Rosie, and he begins to get up, and I pulled him down in the chair. Let the Bassetts come in here if they want you, Rosie. But don't you, so help me move outside this room. It was 4 o'clock in the morning then, and if we'd have raised the blinds, we'd have seen daylight. Did he go? I asked innocently. Sure he went. Mr. Wolfsheim's nose flashed at me indignantly. He turned around in the door and says, Don't let the waiter take away my coffee. Then he went out on the sidewalk and they shot him 3 times in his full belly and drove away. 4 of them were electrocuted, I said, remembering. 5 with Becca. His nostrils turned to me in an interesting way. I understand you're looking for a business connection. Now the juxtaposition of these 2 remarks was startling. Gatsby answered for me. Oh, no, he exclaimed. This isn't the man. No? Mr. Wolfsheim seemed disappointed. This is just a friend. I told you we'd talk about that some other time. I beg your pardon, said Mr. Wolfsheim. I had a wrong man. A business connection. The reason why Fitzgerald is saying connection is so he's emphasizing Wolfsheim's accent, and a business connection is something that is shady or perhaps illegal, right? 71, it says a succulent hash arrived. Succulent is like mouth-watering. And Mr. Wolfsheim, forgetting the more sentimental atmosphere of the old metropole, began to eat with ferocious delicacy. His eyes, meanwhile, roved very slowly all around the room. He completed the arc by turning to inspect the people directly behind. I think that except for my presence, he would have taken one short glance beneath our own table. It's like he's checking everything, looking over his shoulder, right, watching his back. Look here, old sport, said Gatsby, leaning toward me. I'm afraid I made you a little angry this morning in the car. There was the smile again, but this time I held out against it. I don't like mysteries, I answered, and I don't understand why you won't come out frankly and tell me what you want. Why has it got to come through Miss Baker? Oh, it's nothing underhand, or not moral, he assured me. Miss Baker is a great sportswoman, you know, and she'd never do anything that wasn't all right, which is ironic to Nick and to the readers because, as we know, Nick has told us, Jordan was incurably dishonest. Okay, so either Gatsby doesn't know her very well, or he's lying, or, it's something goofy. Nick kind of is like, really? Suddenly he looked at his watch, jumped up, and hurried from the table, leaving with Mr. Wolfsheim at the table. Yes, the telephone, said Mr. Wolfsheim, following him with his eyes. Fine fellow, isn't he? Handsome to look at and a perfect gentleman. Yes. He's an Oxford man. Oh. 72. He went to Oxford College in England. You know Oxford College? I've heard of it. It's one of the most famous colleges in the world. Have you known Gatsby for a long time? I inquired. Several years, he answered in a gratified way. I made the pleasure of his acquaintance just after the war, but I knew I had discovered a man of fine breeding after I talked with him an hour. I said to myself, now there's a kind of man you'd like to take home and introduce to your mother and sister. He paused. I see you're looking at my cufflinks. I hadn't been looking at them, but I was now. They were composed of oddly familiar pieces of ivory. Finest specimens of human molars, he informed me. Well, I inspected him. That's a very interesting idea. Yeah. He flipped his sleeves up under his coat. Yeah, Gatsby's very careful about women. He would never so much look at a friend's wife. When the subject of this instinctive trust returned to the table and sat down, Mr. Wolfsheim drank his coffee with a jerk and got to his feet. Mr. Wolfsheim, who has human teeth as cufflinks. A little shady. Don't hurry, Meyer, said Gatsby without enthusiasm. Mr. Wolfsheim raised his hand in a sort of benediction. You're very polite, but I belong to another generation, he announced solemnly. You sit here and discuss your imaginary I'm sorry, you sit here and discuss your sports and your young ladies and your, he supplied an imaginary noun with another wave of his hand. As for me, I am 50 years old and I won't impose myself any longer. As he shook hands and turned away, his tragic nose was trembling. I wondered if I had said anything to offend him. He becomes very sentimental sometimes, explained Gatsby. This is one of his sentimental days. He's quite a character around New York, a denizen of Broadway. Who is he, anyhow? An actor? No. A dentist? Meyer Wolfsheim? No, he's a gambler. Gatsby hesitated, then added coolly, he's the man who fixed the World Series back in 1919. Remember our Black Sox scandal with the White Sox who purposely lost the World Series? Fix the World Series, I repeated. The idea staggered me. I remembered, of course, that the World Series had been fixed in 1919, but if I had thought of it at all, I would have thought of it as a thing that just merely happened, the end of some inevitable chain. It never occurred to me that one man could start to play with the faith of 50 million people with the single-mindedness of a burglar blowing a safe. Well, how did he happen to do that? I asked after a minute. He just saw the opportunity. Why isn't he in jail? They can't get him, old sport. He's a smart man. I insisted on paying the check. As the waiter brought my change, I caught sight of Tom Buchanan across the crowded room. Hey, come along with me for a minute, I said. I've got to say hello to someone. When he saw us, Tom jumped up, took half a dozen steps in our direction. Where have you been? He demanded eagerly. Daisy's furious because you haven't called up. 74. This is Mr. Gatsby, Mr. Buchanan. They shook hands briefly, and a strained, unfamiliar look of embarrassment came over Gatsby's face. How have you been, anyhow? Demanded Tom of me. How'd you happen to come up this far to eat? I've been having lunch with Mr. Gatsby. I turned toward Mr. Gatsby, but he was no longer there, so he had vanished. Okay, here's another space now in the page, so we're switching scenes again. And right now you're going to hear Nick and Jordan, and they're at the Plaza Hotel, and they're having tea, right? This is kind of like a little date. Sorry, I'm trying to get the light here. So Jordan now is going to tell Nick the story that Gatsby wants her to tell him, okay? And she's talking about when they were younger, okay? So imagine Jordan talking. One October day in 1917, said Jordan Baker that afternoon, sitting up very straight on a straight chair in the tea garden at the Plaza Hotel. I was walking along from one place to another, half on the sidewalks and half on the lawns. I was happier on the lawns because I had on shoes from England with rubber knobs on the soles that bit into the soft ground. Remember, she's a golfer. She's got funky shoes. I had on a new plaid skirt also that blew a little in the wind, and whenever this happened, the red, white, and blue banners in front of all the houses, remember, the war's going on, so they're being patriotic. Excuse me. The banners in front of all the houses stretched out stiff and said, tut, 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 in a disapproving way. The largest of the banners and the largest of the lawns belonged to Daisy Faye's house. She was just 18, 2 years older than me, and by far the most popular of all the young girls in Louisville. She dressed in white, there's your color motif, and had a little white roadster. And all day long the telephone rang in her house, and excited young officers from Camp Taylor demanded the privilege of monopolizing her that night, anyways for an hour. When I came opposite her house that morning, her white roadster was beside the curb, and she was sitting in it with a lieutenant I had never seen before. They were so engrossed in each other that she didn't see me until I was 5 feet away. Top of 75. Hello, Jordan, she called unexpectedly. Please come here. I was flattered that she wanted to speak to me because of all the older girls I admired her the most. She asked me if I was going to the Red Cross and make bandages. Remember, the Red Cross is a volunteer organization, and they helped during the war. And that's what Southern young girls did during that time, did something proper. I was. Well then, would I go and tell them that she couldn't come that day? The officer looked at Daisy while she was speaking in a way that every young girl wants to be looked at sometime. And because it seemed romantic to me, I've remembered the incident ever since. His name was J. Gatsby, and I didn't lay eyes on him again for over 4 years. Even after I'd met him on Long Island, I didn't realize it was the same man. That was 1917. By the next year, I had a few beaux, or suitors, or boys wanting to date her myself, and I began to play in tournaments, so I didn't see Daisy very often. She went with a slightly older crowd, when she went with anyone at all. Wild rumors were circulating about her, how her mother had found her packing her bag one winter night to go to New York and say goodbye to a soldier who was going overseas. She was effectually prevented, but she wasn't on speaking terms with her family for several weeks. After that, she didn't play around with the soldiers anymore, but only with a few flat-footed, short-sighted young men in town who couldn't get into the army at all. So the important part to note here, okay, is that her family did not want her going or associating or having anything to do with a soldier. Why? Because soldiers are poor, and rich girls don't marry poor boys. Last paragraph on page 75. By the next autumn, she was gay again, gay as ever. She had a debut, which is kind of like a quinceañera or like a coming out ball. Think of like when you saw The Princess and the Frog, how the one chick had this big ball for her 18th birthday, so very, very similar, okay? So she had a debut after the armistice, which is when the enemies surrendered and we won World War I. So she had a debut after the armistice, and in February she was presumably engaged to a man from New Orleans. But in June, she married Tom Buchanan of Chicago with more pomp and circumstance than Louisville ever knew before. He came down with 100 people in 4 private cars, train cars, and hired a whole floor of the Mulbach Hotel. And the day before the wedding, he gave her a string of pearls valued at $350,000. So now if I flip back a page, okay, this is in 1917, okay, or 1918. $365,000 at that time was a really long time, okay? It's more than my house costs right now. Super freaking rich. Top of 76. Jordan says, I was a bridesmaid. I came into her room half an hour before the bridal dinner, right, the rehearsal dinner, and I found her lying on her bed, as lovely as the June night in her flowered dress and as drunk as a monkey. She had a bottle of Sauterne in one hand and a letter in the other. Gratulate me, she muttered. Never had a drink before, but oh, how I do enjoy it. Okay, so she wasn't someone, she didn't drink a lot. What's the matter, Daisy? I was scared, I can tell you. I'd never seen a girl like that before. Here, dearest. She groped around in a wastebasket in the trash she had with her on the bed and pulled out the string of pearls. Take 'em downstairs and give 'em back to whoever they belong to. Tell 'em all Daisy's changed her mind. Say, Daisy's changed her mind. Right? She's talking like that because she's drunk. She began to cry. She cried and cried. I rushed out and found her mother's maid, and we locked the door and got her into a cold bath. And she wouldn't let go of the letter. She took it into the tub with her and squeezed it up into a wet ball and only let me leave it in the soap dish when she saw that it was coming to pieces like snow. But she didn't say another word. We gave her spirits of ammonia and put ice on her forehead and hooked her back into her dress, and half an hour later, when we walked out of the room, the pearls were around her neck, and the incident was over. Next day at 5 o'clock, she married Tom Buchanan without so much as a shiver, and started off on a 3-month trip to the South Seas. I saw them in Santa Barbara when they came back, and I thought I'd never seen a girl so mad or crazy about her husband. If he left the room, on the top of page 77, she'd look around uneasily and say, "Where's Tom gone?" and wear the most abstracted expression until she saw him coming in the door. She used to sit on the sand with his head in her lap by the hour, rubbing her fingers over his eyes and looking at him with unfathomable delight. It was touching to see them together. It made you laugh in a hushed, fascinated way. That was in August. A week after I left Santa Barbara, Tom ran into a wagon, another car, on the Ventura Road one night and ripped a front wheel off his car. The girl who was with him got into the newspapers, too, because her arm was broken. She was one of the chambermaids in the Santa Barbara Hotel. One of the maids, okay? So it's clear here that Gatsby, okay, again, after their honeymoon, was found cheating on Daisy or screwing around with some girl from a hotel, one of the maids. And it was kind of embarrassing because it was in the papers. The next April, Daisy had a little girl, and they went to France for a year. I saw them one spring in Caen, and later in Deauville, or however you say something in French. And then they came back to Chicago to settle down. Daisy was popular in Chicago, as you know. They moved with a fast crowd, all of them young and rich and wild. But she came out with an absolutely perfect reputation. Perhaps because she doesn't drink. It's a great advantage not to drink among hard-drinking people. You can hold your tongue, and moreover, you can time any little irregularity of your own so that everybody else is so blind that they don't see or care. Perhaps Daisy never went in for amour at all. And yet there's something in that voice of hers. Amour, that's French for love. So maybe, Jordan says, maybe Daisy didn't get married for love after all. Well, about 6 weeks ago, she heard the name Gatsby for the first time in years. It was when I asked you, do you remember? This is back from chapter 1, if you knew Gatsby in Westang after you had gone home. She came into my room and woke me up and said, "What, Gatsby?" And then I described him. I was half asleep, and she said in the strangest of voice that it must be the man she used to know. It wasn't until then that I connected this Gatsby with the officer in her white car. Top of 78. When Jordan Baker had finished telling all this, we had left the plaza for half an hour and were driving in a Victoria through Central Park. The sun had gone down behind the tall apartments of the movie stars in the West 50s, and the clear voices of little girls, already gathered like crickets on the grass, rose through the hot twilight. I'm the Sheik of Araby, your love belongs to me. At night when you're asleep, into your tent I'll creep. So it's like some song that they're singing. It was a strange coincidence, I said. Oh, but it wasn't a coincidence at all. Why not? Gatsby bought that house so that Daisy would be just across the bay. Ah, that it had not been merely the stars to which he had aspired on that June night. Remember in chapter 1 where he's reaching toward that green light? That's Daisy's house across the bay. He came alive to me, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purplish splendor. He wants to know, continued Jordan, if you'll invite Daisy to your house some afternoon, and then let him come over. The modesty of the demand shook me. He had waited 5 years and bought a mansion where he dispensed starlight to the casual moths so that he could come over some afternoon to the stranger's garden. Did I have to know all of this before he could ask such a little thing? He's afraid he's waited so long. He thought you might be offended, you see. He's a regular tough underneath it all. Top of 79. Something worried me. Why didn't he ask you to arrange a meeting? He wants her to see his house, she explained, and your house is right next door. Oh. I think he half expected her to wander into one of his parties some night, went on Jordan, but she never did. Then he began asking people casually if they knew her, and I was the first one he found. It was that night he sent for me at his dance, and you should have heard the elaborate way he worked up to it. Of course, I immediately suggested a luncheon in New York, and I thought he'd go mad. I don't want to do anything out of the way, he kept saying. I want to see her right next door. Okay, so because he wants her to see his house. Think, poor Gatsby couldn't marry Daisy. Daisy wouldn't wait for him because he was poor. And now he has all the money, and he's thrown these parties every weekend, and that's the reason why he throws these crazy parties, in hopes that she'll come in. Okay. Middle of 79. When I said you were a particular friend of Tom's, he started to abandon the whole idea. He doesn't know very much about Tom, though he says he's read a Chicago paper for years, just on the chance of catching a glimpse of Daisy's name. It was dark now, and as we dipped under a little bridge, I put my arm around Jordan's golden shoulder and drew her toward me and asked her to dinner. Suddenly, I wasn't thinking of Daisy and Gatsby anymore, but of this clean, hard, limited person who dealt in universal skepticism and who leaned back jauntily just within the circle of my arm. A phrase began to beat in my ears with a sort of heady excitement. There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the dead. And the tired. And Daisy ought to have something in her life, murmured Jordan to me. Does she want to see Gatsby? She's not to know about it. Gatsby doesn't want her to know. You're just supposed to invite her to tea. Top of page 80. We passed a barrier of dark trees and then the facade or the face of 59th Street. A block of delicate pale light beamed down into the park. Unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices or corners and blinding signs. And so I drew up the girl beside me, tightening my arms. Her wan, scornful mouth smiled, and so I drew her up again closer, this time to my face. And so they kissed. And that is how chapter 4 ends.